It's 1999. You're hunched over a PlayStation controller, slick with sweat. On screen, a man named Harry Mason stumbles through the fog, so thick that it feels alive. The radio crackles, something shrieks, and suddenly, you're not just playing a game, you're surviving a nightmare. I was 13 when I first saw Silent Hill. My cousin and I stood in a rental store, desperate for something to play. The games that we wanted, they were all gone. And then I saw it. A man's face in negative with a girl's shadow frozen in headlights. It creeped me out, but I knew I had to know more. My cousin groaned, "This looks boring," but I begged him, and we took it home. We popped it into the PS1, and the sunlight poured in through the windows. How scary could it be? 10 minutes later, we were screaming at the blood-stained school hallway. The daylight, it didn't matter. Silent Hill didn't need darkness to terrify. It rewired my brain. And I wasn't the only one. Strap in. We're diving into the twisted origins, tragedy, and genius that didn't just challenge survival horror, it rewrote the rules. The door creaks open, your character turns around, and then something shambles into view. You're not just playing a game, you're surviving one. Welcome to the golden age of survival horror. A time when games weren't just about high scores or saving princesses. They were about fear, cold sweats, jump scares, and the dread of what lurked in the next shadow. No franchise owned that terror quite like Resident Evil. Capcom's blockbuster had redefined horror gaming overnight. Tank controls, claustrophobic camera angles, limited ammo, it was revolutionary. By 1998, Resident Evil 2 had cemented the genre as a cultural force. But while Capcom was busy perfecting the formula, another titan was quietly plotting to tear it all down. Enter Konami. If you were a gamer in the 90s, Konami wasn't just a developer. They were legends. They'd been crafting icons since the arcade era. Contra, Castlevania, Metal Gear. By the late 90s, they were untouchable. Metal Gear Solid dropped in 1998, and it wasn't just a game. It was a cinematic masterpiece, proving Konami could blend storytelling and gameplay like no one else. They were innovators, risk-takers, and maybe a little cocky. But here's the twist. Survival horror wasn't their turf. Not yet. So the stage is set. Survival horror is exploding. Konami's riding high, and they want a piece of that terror pie. But how did a studio known for run-and guns and tactical espionage end up birthing one of horror's most haunting legacies? While Capcom ruled the genre, Konami saw an opportunity. Not to copy, but to reinvent. They didn't want zombies in mansions. They wanted something darker, more psychological. Something that didn't just scare you, but it unsettled you. But here's the kicker. Konami didn't hand this project to their A-team. Nah, they gave it to the outcasts, the developers who didn't quite fit the mold. The ones some at the company reportedly called undesirable. Yeah, you heard that right. The team behind Silent Hill, it wasn't Konami's golden crew. They were just rookies, some of them fresh out of college, others shuffled from canceled projects, many of whom had never worked on a horror game. But that lack of experience, well, that became their secret weapon. No expectations, no pressure, just raw, unfiltered creativity. And so, in a dimly lit Tokyo office, a ragtag team of developers, many of whom had never worked on a horror game, started drafting ideas. Their mission? To create a game that would ditch campy B-movie tropes and plunge players into a nightmare that felt personal. A town shrouded in fog, a father searching for his daughter, monsters that weren't just grotesque, but symbolic. This was Silent Hill. So who were these underdogs? Let's start with Keiichiro Toyama, the director. Before Silent Hill, Toyama was known for, point-and-click adventure and track and field games. Not exactly horror resume material, but Konami saw something in him, a knack for moody atmospheres and twisted storytelling. Hiroyuki Owaku was obsessed with religious history, so he was hired on to help write the story and the events in Silent Hill. Masahiro Ito was hired on to Konami in order to join Team Silent. His job was to design the creatures that would haunt our dreams. And then there's Takayoshi Sato, an artist who was hired on to help with the environments, characters, and the overall feel of the game. Along with others, they called themselves Team Silent, a name that's almost ironic given how loudly their game would come to later scream into the genre. Now imagine the pitch meeting. The executives at Konami wanted their own Resident Evil, a cash cow dripping with zombies and jump scares. They demanded for the team to use a Hollywood-esque approach. Their goal was to have American players want to play this game. Here's where things get interesting though. Toyama and crew went full renegade. Maybe it was the need to prove to the higher-ups that they were wrong, that they weren't just a bunch of misfits, or maybe it's because they knew their ideas were bound for glory. But either way, they decided that real survival horror wasn't about monsters. It was about helplessness.
Barry! Where's Barry?
They ditched Capcom's campy dialogue and B-movie vibes. Instead, they filled Silent Hill with existential dread, cult symbolism, and a soundtrack that sounded like they had broken the radio to tune it to hell. Instead of ornate mansions, they envisioned a decaying American town. Instead of zombies, they designed creatures that mirrored the protagonist's guilt and trauma. And instead of fixed camera angles, they fought for a dynamic third-person view that made you feel stalked by the unknown. But here's the crazy part. None of this was supposed to work. A team of underdogs? A genre they didn't understand? A story too bleak for mainstream audiences? On paper, it was a disaster. Except, it wasn't. It was a masterpiece in the making. Okay, so Team Silent had their team name and their assignment. But now what? They were given 2 years to build a game that would redefine horror. To put that into perspective, Resident Evil 2 took 3 years. But Konami wasn't known for patience, especially with their so-called B team, so the clock started to tick. Where do you even start when you're inventing a nightmare? For Team Silent, it began with questions. Not how do we scare people, but how do we unsettle them? How do we make fear personal? They obsessed with themes that went deeper than survival, guilt, grief, and the monsters we can create in our own minds. And to nail that vibe, they turned to some unconventional inspiration. David Lynch's Twin Peaks was their North Star. That mix of small-town Americana with surreal dread, they wanted something discomforting but familiar. Take a protagonist like Harry Mason. They didn't want a soldier or a cop. They wanted an everyman. A widowed dad in a cheesy jacket, stumbling through hell to save his daughter. No training, no plot armor, just love and desperation. And then there's the town itself. Silent Hill wasn't just going to be a setting, it was going to be a character. A place that had been shaped by guilt, with streets that mirrored the protagonist's psyche. And to nail that, the team studied American ghost towns and used a variety of religious iconography to keep things grounded in realism. Real horror, they realized, wasn't about grandeur, it was about relatability. And what about those monsters? Artist Masahiro Ito worked as background and monster designer in Silent Hill. He wouldn't rely on the typical ideas of what monsters should look like. Instead, he designed his monsters after humans, but he would distort them in some unique way to make them more morbid and repulsive. Takayoshi Sato was another artist who was hired to design characters as well, but legend has it that management didn't believe in him so he was relegated to doing things like making titles and file sorting. But he knew he was capable of more, so he created a small 3D video demo, something that many of his coworkers had no idea how to do. And when asked how he did it, he threatened to never teach them unless they gave him a more serious assignment. And the wild part? They did. Sato didn't just sketch demons or characters though. He created 3D models of them, and then the other artists based their drawings on those models. The final part of the trifecta was the sound. Oh, the sound. Composer Akira Yamaoka, a new hire at Konami, blended industrial noise with melancholic piano loops. He recorded broken radios and even screeching metals. The result? A soundtrack that didn't just accompany the horror, it was the horror. By mid-1998, the pieces were coming together. The team worked in a bubble. No leaks, no hype, just pure focus. They knew the stakes. This wasn't just a game. It was a manifesto. Proof that the undesirables could out-innovate the industry's giants. And for a moment, it felt like they might actually pull it off. But lurking beneath all of that creativity were sleeping problems. And just like the other world, they were hidden below the surface. By late 1998, Team Silent Dream was starting to rot. The same creativity that fueled their early wins was now backfiring. Konami's higher-ups were getting nervous. The budget started to shrink, deadlines tightening, and that hands-off approach that once gave them freedom, it was slowly slipping away. Suddenly, they were faced with technical disasters. The hardware in the PlayStation 1 began to buckle under their ambition. That iconic fog, it wasn't just atmosphere, it was a crutch. It was used to hide the console's inability to render distant objects, the only way for the devs to get the game to run at a respectable frame rate, and it was to keep the draw distance as close as possible, sometimes loading only a couple of assets at a time. But the only way to hide it from the player was to add fog. Fog that should have been a placeholder for them to figure out a way to make the game run better. This also introduced the problem of enemies that couldn't be seen until they were right in the player's face. It made it easier to die, especially since our protagonist wasn't a hero, and in turn, it made the experience feel cheap. But the real nightmare was the plot. Team Silent's story was too weird for Konami. A cult summoning a god through a reincarnated child? The execs called it incoherent. The confidence in the team was starting to falter, and this group of outcasts was starting to feel the pressure. They knew that this would be their last chance at saving their careers, but if they couldn't pull it together, they were going to be packing their bags as soon as the game released. Sato, who was given his first opportunity to show that he could earn their respect, was still being doubted. In fact, his supervisor was so unsure that he could pull it off, he was insisting that they needed to assign a visual supervisor to oversee Sato's work, and this would mean that he wouldn't receive any credit, despite being largely responsible for all of the designs in the game. This led to many all-nighters and months of frustration. By the end of 1998, their morale was in a freefall. The game was a mess of bugs, half-finished levels, and corporate sabotage. Rumor is Konami gave them an ultimatum: ship it by September or bury it. Team Silent was trapped. Do they cave in to Konami's demands, or do they risk everything on a vision that even they weren't sure was going to work? In the end, they chose perseverance. By the summer of 1999, Team Silent was out of time, out of money, and out of good faith. But they weren't out of fight. Konami had started to voice their concerns. The game was starting to buckle under the weight of the ambition, and the clock was screaming ship or die. So, they did what all great rebels do. They got smarter. The performance issues? They had been addressed with a temporary fix of the fog, but instead of looking at it like a placeholder, it became a feature. The fog-filled town made it feel deserted and added to the feeling of desperation and claustrophobia. What about the enemies suddenly appearing in front of the player, leaving them defenseless? Well, that's where the radio comes in. By using radio static, they were able to help the player hear where the enemies were without having to show them. This also added to the creep factor, since now the player didn't even have to see the enemy in order to be struck with paralyzing fear. What about Sato? He wasn't going to allow his supervisor to take away all of his hard work and let some other supervisor take credit. So in order to avoid this from happening, Sato agreed to take charge of all of the CGI cinematics, single-handedly. Sato created the high-resolution versions of the characters all alone. He did the environments and all the parts of the modeling, including texturing and lighting. This involved Sato practically living at the office. He worked all day, and then used every computer in the office to render the 3D footage he created at night when everybody was out of the office. This allowed him to finish all of the cinematics without interfering with the other devs, and in doing so, he was able to complete it in record time, not only ensuring he received credit, but showing everybody at Konami just how much of a beast he really was. And in a moment of glory, Silent Hill was presented to the audience at Atlanta's E3, where the game was received with great applause and excitement from the audience. This is what it took to convince Konami that this team really wasn't a group of losers, and in turn Konami finally conceded, and they agreed to allocate more of a budget and more staff in order to ensure that the game got completed. By August in 1999, the impossible happened. Silent Hill went gold. A game born from corporate doubt, technical nightmares, and a team of undesirables was finished. But it wasn't just finished, it was alive. The fog choked the streets, the radio static hissed with malice, and Alessa's nightmare, a girl's pain made flesh, waited in the dark. Silent Hill was no longer a town, it was a reckoning. As the team pressed the final build onto a disc, they knew they'd smuggled their nightmares into the world, and now it was time to let it loose. Silent Hill hit store shelves in 1999. No confetti, no billboards, just a quiet whisper into the void. Team Silent's underdog horror, born from corporate skepticism and duct tape code, was finally real. And nobody, not even Konami, was ready for what came next. Critics received the game with favorable reviews, many praising its approach to survival horror. Though comparisons to Resident Evil were inevitable, many reviewers agreed that Silent Hill wasn't just a cheap copy, it was an evil clone. It was even referred to as the perfect nightmare sim, which took advantage of PlayStation's limitations to chilling effect. Players agreed, the game was selling like crazy. Konami was expecting a flop, but they were wrong, and they began to scramble to print more discs. But not everyone was sold. Some called the combat clunky. Others said it was a shameless attempt at cashing in on Resident Evil's fame, while yet others said that it was hard to forgive the bad voice acting.
How do you feel?
Oh, like I've been run over by a truck. But I'm alright, I guess.
It felt stiff and as if it was done by a bunch of amateurs. But Team Silent didn't care. They proved the doubters wrong. They set out to bring a nightmare to life, and they succeeded at that. By 2001, Silent Hill had sold over 2 million copies worldwide, a smash for a new IP. 2 million copies also guaranteed that Silent Hill would become one of PlayStation's greatest hits. But the success they had wasn't just in its sales, it was in the legacy that they created. Silent Hill didn't just escape Resident Evil's shadow, it redefined what horror could be. Where Capcom used zombies, Konami gave us guilt. Where Resident Evil had jump scares, Silent Hill had silence. And that fog, it became a metaphor for gaming itself. What you don't see is scarier than what you do. The ripple effect was instant. Games like Fatal Frame, Siren, and even Dead Space would later borrow its DNA, the slow burns, the psychological rot. But Silent Hill's greatest trick? turning its developers' struggles into art, the crunch, the doubt, the corporate meddling, it all bled into the game's soul. Today, Silent Hill isn't just a game. It's a language, a genre, a cult. And it all started with a team of undesirables who turned their desperation into poetry. So the next time you play a horror game that lingers, that aches, remember the fog, remember the static, remember that sometimes the most beautiful nightmares come from the unlikeliest dreams. And maybe it's time that you did.